So welcome once again to our study, Progressive Stages of Emptiness. Now I'm going to have a few new people with us here today, so I'm going to make it somewhat, you could say, user-friendly and gentle. There's some discussions about the sort of the intricate aspects of Shenton philosophy that I might pass light on, and I think I'm more going to be just talking along the lines of what we call Buddha nature. So I think everybody's probably cool with that. And this is sort of you could say a very basic perspective in the Buddhist teaching. So I apologize to you guys that are here. Normally, we're up in a different place, and that's where I have a projector that then sort of what I'm going through here in terms of the book is projected onto the wall, so then everybody can see. But we had a little bit of an internet hiccup just here, and so we've had to move down here, where Michela, our hostess, very generously is hosting us. But I'm going to be just going very slowly over the material today, and I'll read it and just sort of basically talk about the basic principles in this. This is part of the last sessions of a book that I've been presenting for the last 6 months, probably more actually. So it sort of builds on everything else that has been discussed. At the same time, I'm also thinking to just make it a little bit user-friendly for some of us who are new here, and some of us who are new here are actually not here, but I think they will eventually sort of show up, and this is anyway intended to be user-friendly. The other thing is, from the 16th of May onward, I'm going to be generally doing what's called Introduction to Buddhism. And this is because I think it's important that there is really a place within Siddhartha's intent that we actually accommodate, you could say, more basic discussions around the Buddhist teaching. So I have been, this you could say falls probably into the category of more advanced teaching in some respect. So I'm going to be doing from here henceforward really more. This Monday will be really more about just providing a very general, you could say, presentation of Buddhism, just to give sort of an idea of what the theory of Buddhism is about and the application of it or practice. So that's what's going to be happening from now onwards. But I would like to just finish the present text that we've been looking at. And like I was just saying before, normally we have the text projected up on the wall, but we can't do that down here. So I'm just going to read it very slowly. So first of all, the topic at hand is something called Tathagata Garbha in Sanskrit, which means the heart of suchness. Now, the entire Buddhist teaching is essentially equipped with an incredibly positive view. Despite what you might have out, what's sort of being spoken about, there's about Buddhism, where very often you hear about Buddhism saying, yeah, well, the Buddhists, they say everything's suffering, isn't it? And that's fair enough. That's a bit like doctors. They say, doctors are all about suffering, but the doctors, they're not about suffering because they want everybody to be sick or because they're saying everybody is sick, but they're just focused on suffering because their job is to alleviate suffering. So in the Buddhist teaching, there's an awareness that, yes, psychologically, there's a little bit of misalignment that's taking place, but that's workable. So there is, you could say, there's a difference between us and the Buddha in some sense, but in the other sense, it's just like the difference between the doctor and the patient. It's not as if the doctor's a better person. It's just that the doctor is healthy and also the condition is removable. So the good thing about when we talk about suffering in the Buddhist teaching, it's really that it's out there and say, well, there's a basic sort of cognitive, dysfunction that's taking place, but this is completely removable. Otherwise, there would be no path. There would be no point. And it's just like, okay, we're bound to suffer, forget it, Then there would be no point in the Buddhist teaching. But of course, the premise is that we are essentially, our basic disposition is pure, unconfused, undelusional, and you could say primordially we are Buddhas. And, you know, in the 1960s when Zen became very fashionable, they were sort of, yeah, well, we're all Buddhas. And that's kind of okay as a cliche, but the problem is, how do we actually do that? Yes, I am a Buddha, but I still look and feel pretty much the way I've always felt. So it's not as if this is really helping me a lot. So that's where there are essentially what we call two purities that we'd say we all have. One is a fundamental purity, and then there's the purity of having eliminated the temporary condition of confusion. And that's what separates us from the Buddha. That's why there is a Buddhist path. And essentially the Buddhist path is really just to heal or come back to this original condition. That's our natural condition. But that fundamental nature, that is what we call Buddha nature, or in this case, Tathagata Garbha means really the heart of suchness. And what we mean with suchness is that there is a place where we're aligned with things as they are. Right now, we're not in touch with suchness. We are very much caught up in a condition of delusion that's very much hinges on a little neurotic twitch, a little sort of neurotic something that's happening in us that's called fixation on self. And everybody who comes across Buddhism, they probably hear that the Buddhists talk about no self. And that's true. There is actually a place where this unconscious place in which we fall into a rather insecure place that is very much making ourselves the center of the universe. This thing we call fixation on self, and we actually have it in our language where we just refer to it as plain selfishness. The only problem is when we in our ordinary language talk about selfishness, it's kind of a moralistic thing, like thou should not be selfish and you should be selfless. And that's kind of okay too. Actually, it's nice when people are selfless, even though you could say it's a moralistic thing. You know, we probably get along better when we're selfless, and we probably get along less well when we're selfish. So it's kind of a good thing that every once in a while there's somebody who says, be less selfish, or, you know, we kind of wake up to this sort of idea that we should actually be nice. It sort of works better for everybody. But the Buddha's point is that actually the whole drama around self, that's a fundamental delusion. That's where actually we go wrong. An entire purpose of the Buddhist teaching is actually to identify the way in which we misperceive ourselves and we misperceive the world around us. We attribute a solidity to this notion of self that actually is not founded on anything. Because if we investigate, there is actually no self. There's nothing but a constant shifting, you could say, series of moments, conscious moments, in which we are always changing. And yet we're always attributing a continuity, like me. I say me, and I've done this since I was as long as I can remember, but I've actually been all sorts of things. And I get kind of annoyed if somebody comes and says, oh yeah, I know you, Jakob, you're like this. And I say, no, I'm not. You know, there's sort of, you know, but everybody's has a sense of continuity or solidity within themselves and also in the world that they perceive. The idea that we're talking about when we say the heart of suchness is actually there's a place within our psychology, within our mind, that is not caught up in that delusional misalignment. And that's why the entire Buddhist path is really about us cutting through this delusion. And that's where the Buddhist teaching operates with two, well, yeah, I guess we could say two methodologies. One is theory. The theory really is challenging our assumptions about reality. And that's where Buddhism is very similar in many ways to what we call science or natural sciences. It operates with analysis. It doesn't say, well, because the Buddha said so, then we're going to just tag along with that. The Buddha actually said, please investigate your assumptions. Please investigate the nature of your reality. Please have a look. Essentially, everything in Buddhism we call vipassana or wisdom really comes from us personally getting an experience based on our observation and beginning to sort of learn you could say, observe and begin to see something that we hadn't seen before. And it's not as if the Buddha gives us an answer. It's not as if the Buddha says, okay, this is what you're going to see. Because that's not what the Buddha is about. If that was the case, then Buddha would end up becoming a new fundamentalist, belief system, a new dogma, saying, okay, this is what we believe. The Buddha is actually more about just beginning to dismantle the preconceptions we have about ourselves and the phenomenal world. So you could say the Buddhist teaching as we have it, it consists on one hand on a theory that is very much what we could call a critique, where we're more about just analyzing our assumptions. That's a lot what the Buddhist teaching is about. The other is a component of practice, which is what we then refer to as meditation. And of course, all of us are familiar with meditation. There's sort of a general notion that meditation is where you sit down and you calm the mind. And that's incredibly valuable. And everybody should do it, always. You can't really go wrong with it. And even within like schools across Australia, in New South Wales and so on, kids, despite what the kids want or not, they're actually being sort of subjected to what they call mindfulness, in the sense that you sit and you watch your breath for a few minutes at the beginning of class. And it's actually not a bad thing. It is very much helpful anytime that we sit and are just a little bit unplugged, which is of course difficult since we are eternally plugged in. There's constantly, entertainment available at our fingertips. It's very rare that we actually just unplug. But the thing is, when we unplug and allow ourselves to just have some modicum of calm, we actually emerge as much more sane individuals. It's like people, when they relax, they just become nicer. It's not as if something miraculous happens, that the good Lord descends down into them, or that something incredible is happening. It's just that we come to our sanity. So the whole nature of meditation is very unmystical. It's incredibly straightforward. It's like we sit down, we breathe possibly even a bit slower, and we're just present. There's every reason to appreciate and understand the logic of that. What of course we're talking about here in terms of eliminating confusion. That's where we hook up meditation with a wider vision. And that vision is when we analyze our assumptions around self and our, you would say, self-centering, we begin to see, hey, my self-centering is actually based on what exactly? What do I get out of reacting angrily? What do I get out of acting with arrogance? What do I get out of acting in the various kind of toxic ways that we probably know is not really what we want to be, but we sometimes get very uptight, and we get sort of uptight around me. And that's where we probably, unless we're very insensitive, we probably realize that's not very helpful for ourselves or for anybody around us. And that's where we can see there's something that I need to do that is quite helpful. And that's where we have a vision. And we could tentatively refer to that as some degree of understanding no self. But it's very difficult to apply this in everyday life unless there is some quality of calm in which this can sort of settle into our being. So meditation in that sense is a place where we actually allow for this vision to begin to soak in. So that's why in the Buddhist tradition, we talk about two aspects of meditation. One is the calm aspect, which we call shamatha, and the other is this place where this vision of sanity begins to penetrate us, and that's where we talk about vipassana. Of course, nowadays vipassana, sometimes, like for example, in the Burmese tradition, Goenkaji's tradition, and so on, then we refer to meditation as vipassana. And that's fair enough, but it's really, you could say, the purpose of meditation is to arrive at vipassana. So that sort of is the label vipassana, but strictly speaking, there are two components in that. And one is the framework of calm, and the other is then the greater aerial perspective, the clarity that begins to emerge within that practice. But all of that is really intended to facilitate that we connect with something that we already possess, which we then refer to as Buddha nature, suchness. And it's also because if we look at the world, in some way we could say there's nothing wrong with the world as such. There's a lot wrong with individual subjectivities. It's not that the world is a bad place. And many of us sort of grow up with the sort of the idea of the selfish gene, the idea that we're destined to be selfish. And we also very often get thrown sort of the idea that our existence has no real meaning. We're just sort of here like some sort of bizarre bleep that happens because various sort of components came together, and then all of a sudden there's consciousness. There's a little bit of an explanatory gap exactly how consciousness came about, but nevertheless, here we are, and it's a bit like we're just thrown into this. And that's actually a little bit of an overlooking the incredible miracle, you could say, of the incredible quality of us being conscious individuals in the world around us, being an amazing place. I'm sort of a little bit tempted to say, hey, watch David Attenborough's series on the planets and all that kind of stuff, because it doesn't take much if we just look that the phenomenal world is incredible. It also doesn't take long before we can see it's full of a lot of crazy people, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going down, but we can't really blame that on nature. And the Buddhist teaching also is, interestingly, that we can't even blame it on the individuals. What we can blame it on is this cognitive dysfunction that everybody has. And so it's not really about pointing our finger at the prime minister, or pointing at the men in black, or, you know, the mafia, or, you know, God at the Pentagon or the Kremlin or whatever you have, and saying they're evil. That's not really the case. It's just that there's a profound confusion that reigns within many places. And I would say the first place we really need to identify this confusion is actually in ourselves. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't be politically active. I'm not saying we shouldn't object to war. We shouldn't object to, you know, madness that happens in the world. But we need to have a fundamental sympathy in which we identify that the craziness that happens in this world happens, yes, in individuals, but these individuals are not fundamentally bad. They're just fundamentally deeply confused. And, you know, of course, every once in a while you hear somebody say, well, that guy should really be taken out because that would probably put an end to a lot of trouble and so on. But, and you could say, well, yes, maybe. But the point is that despite however crazy people act, the fundamental stuff is actually good. We could take anybody from Pol Pot to Adolf Hitler, and we can grill their mothers, and the mothers will probably say, well, he was actually a good boy, you know, and so on, you know, but something went wrong. And of course, this applies to basically the notion of Tathagata and the notion of this heart of suchness is, in the Buddhist context, and you could say based on the Buddha's vision, is actually there's not a single sentient being that doesn't have this fundamental goodness. And so it's not as if we have to say, well, you know, I wonder if I could ever, you know, uncover. Basically, the question is, am I fundamentally flawed? That sort of thing. And that's where the Buddha says, no, nobody's fundamentally flawed. In fact, everybody's fundamentally perfect. But the thing is, there's a temporary cloud of confusion that alienates us from this nature. And the entire project of the Buddhist path is really just to align ourselves with that basic goodness, to essentially make that manifest. There's in here, I'm going to get to the text here, which then says, the purpose of teaching the Tathagata is to give meditators, that's people like us here, ladies and gentlemen, confidence that they already have Buddha nature. Without such confidence, it's very difficult to fully rest the mind free from all conceptual contrivance, because there is always a subtle tendency to try to remove or achieve something. Okay, this is a little bit building on the text that we've been going through here, but there's a notion of freeing the mind from conceptual contrivance. And that is essentially the practice of, as we look at our mind, to think that something needs to be done. And that's true, something needs to be done, but it's not going to actually help for us to begin to manipulate our thinking. The interesting thing about the Buddhist path is, of course, yes, there is contemplation, there's a way of thinking positively, there's a way of, you could say, analyzing in a constructive way. But the basic principle of meditation, universally, is really to allow the mind to settle. And with the settling of the mind's clarity emerges. And that's what we mean, freeing the mind from conceptual contrivance. We very often give the picture of if you have a glass of water with some earth or some sand in it. If it's agitated, then the water is very unclear. If we put it on a table, then the sand or earth settles and the water becomes clear, and we can see the actual quality of the water's clarity. So similarly, also, the practice of meditation is very different from the way that we very often think when we look at our mind and we think, gosh, I'm in a really shitty mood, you know? And then we think I should try to think positive. And that's a good thing, definitely. And we should not let our shitty mood affect anybody else. But at the same time, it's very different from correcting our mind to actually allowing something organic to take place in which we settle, and then the mind naturally becomes much more sane. Again, there's nothing mystical about that, but that is where we do something that's different from thinking. And that's where meditation gets this sort of slightly confusing sort of label as being a practice where you have no thoughts. It's not that you don't have any thoughts. You're going to have thoughts. You know, try and not have any thoughts. If you sit down and meditate thinking, when are the no thoughts going to happen? You're going to have to wait for a long time. But at the same time, there's a place where we might possibly not tag along distractedly with the thoughts. And that's where meditation, you could say, is an exceptionally radical practice, because it is within what nowadays also is known as mindfulness. It's with the focus that is not entangled in the ordinary thinking that actually the mind begins to discover its own natural goodness, its own natural clarity. And that's where we could gain some confidence in what we call the mind free from all conceptual contrivance. And that's where this whole Tathagata Garbha, or the heart of suchness, is very, very valuable, because that's where we could actually have, it's essential that we have confidence in our fundamental goodness. So then the Khenpo goes on to say, in the Ratna Gotra Vibhaga, this is a text that belongs to, so it's a text that comes down from an Indian master called Asanga, and it's some teachings where we have, well, a lot of emphasis on this quality of what we call Buddha nature. This is also known as the Mahayana Uttara Tantra Shastra. Anyway, in that text, it says 5 reasons are given for teaching the Tathagata Garbha. And that's again where we're looking at essentially saying all beings fundamentally possess this heart of goodness. So he says, first, it encourages those who would otherwise be so self-deprecating, they would not even try to arouse bodhicitta and attain Buddhahood. So that's where we might sort of just give up on the spiritual path and just think, well, you know, I'm just, you know, I'm the way I am, and I'm never going to change. That's like I'm just stuck. And that's where it's rather important to appreciate that we have this condition that is not tainted, that is not fundamentally confused. And that's where the teaching on Tathagata Garbha is really for us to appreciate that actually we could do something. And particularly arousing bodhicitta is something that in the Buddhist context, and this has been discussed here in some extent, is very much that we could cultivate the mind of a greater vision beyond just me. Basically, go beyond self-centering and embrace the path of selflessness, not as something that we should sort of impose on ourselves, but just from the point of view, almost like yoga practice. You know, when we practice yoga, we're aligning the body with basic condition that's good for us. You know, we're not torturing ourselves if we do yoga. Rather, we're doing something that is quite helpful in terms of just our natural physicality. And so cultivating selflessness doesn't go against our, you could say, person, but it sort of actually aligns ourselves with that. And so then that's the first reason. It gets us over our sort of doubting ourselves. Second, it humbles those who, having aroused bodhicitta, feel intrinsically superior to others who have not. So there might be those who then cultivate and say, okay, I'm committing myself to the path of selflessness. I'm committing myself to the path of enlightenment. I'm now a yogi, and hence I'm superior to the rest. They're all, you know, rather sort of confused and sort of, you know, not quite as enlightened as I am. And that's really a big danger on the spiritual path, which is probably the biggest. My teacher, Jamgön Kongtrul Lodrötaye, is always making a point of how, in fact, the biggest danger on the spiritual path is really arrogance, that we could end up sort of just being holier than thou. And that's where, if we realize that everybody has Buddha nature, then it's like we're not better than anybody else. You know, there might be some people who, you could say, temporarily look pretty confused, but in fact, they're no less than we are. So that's a really important point. Then also, the Khenpo here says, thirdly, it removes the fault of taking the stains, which are unreal, to be the true nature of things. And that's what's intrinsic to the whole, you could say, dogma of the selfish gene. Of course, we could say, well, everybody is selfish. Well, yeah, that's true. And also, as a result, everybody suffers. So you could say it's normal to be selfish, but then also it's normal to suffer as a consequence. Whereas it's very interesting because if we look at persons who are very self-centered, they very often are very unhappy. We look at people who are naturally selfless, and again, we're not talking about people who sort of, you could say, artificially or in a fabricated, contrived way try to be selfless, you know, gritting their teeth and seething with sort of, you could say, suppressed passive aggression and all of that, but genuinely selfless people who just love to give. You can see they're just happier. So it's not about that there's really something particularly mystical about that, but it is really important that we appreciate that we are not basically tainted. And the whole idea that we have, which is, you know, it's sort of partly linked up with Darwin, you know, the survival of the fittest. Also, we have Richard Dawkins' famous book, you know, The Selfish Gene, and so on. There are places in which we think that it's normal to be selfish, but it's actually not. So the Tathagata teaching is very much the recognition that this superficiality of selfishness, all the insecurity that comes from me versus other, us versus them, and so on, is actually an artificial construct. So that's a basic premise for what we call then the Tathagata Garbha. So then it says, fifthly, by showing that all beings are intrinsically of the same nature as the nature of the Buddha, it removes the obstacle to the arising of true compassion, which sees no difference between self and other. And that I would interpret to, well, essentially it is the teaching that there's no difference between us and the Buddha. And that also sounds very nice, sort of an egalitarian sort of language of modern democracy and all of that. But it's a bit more, you could say, it's a bit less abstract than that. Because it's very interesting when persons come across, you could say, deeply confused people, we sort of go, you know, we kind of feel sad for them and sort of feel repulsed. If we come across somebody, and I'm always giving the example of the Dalai Lama, you know, generally when people come across the Dalai Lama, they like him. So we could say the Dalai Lama is sort of a cosmic Superman or something, but the thing is actually the way that we recognize the goodness in the Dalai Lama, it's actually something that works at a very intuitive level. And when we come across nice people, it's not that we sort of say, well, I like them because blah, 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 because of something. It's because of something intangible that actually resonates with something within ourselves. So there is a place, even though we might not presently recognize, you could say, this Buddha nature, we might not recognize goodness as intrinsic to ourselves. That's in a way a little bit of fixation and a little bit of a sort of missing a point about ourselves, and it's a lack of confidence. But the fact that we can recognize it in others, that shows that we have it, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to relate to it. Then it would be, and of course you do have people who come and see the Dalai Lama and they just go, what's he so damn happy about? So, why is he always laughing? Stuff like that. Like, it's rather annoying with such a cheerful person, and that's where people generally, at least, they sort of, hey, I'd like to have what he's having. And in general, there's a sense of some connection with that. So at an intuitive level, we can appreciate how we possess this Buddha nature. And that also, when we can see that there is, when we can appreciate that, then we can also see pretty much if the Dalai Lama did it, I can do it. There's a little bit of that. We might say, well, he came from a special place and all of that. Yeah, sure, but still. And the Dalai Lama never comes across as being a savior. He never comes across as, in the whole Buddhist tradition, teachers don't come across as saying, just follow me and everything will be hunky-dory. The annoying thing about the Buddhist teachers is that they are teachers. Well, that means there's something, our role is not so much to be saved as to actually be hearing what they're saying. There's a message there and there's something to actually apply. So of course that is annoying, because we sometimes in spirituality, there's the idea that you sign up in the church and then everything's just going to be fine. You hold hands and sing along and everything's just beautiful. But here it's about doing something, being proactive. So that's where the sense of empowerment, the sense that can do, is very important. And that's where, again, the teaching on the Tathagata Garbha is rather important. Okay, now the thing about the Buddha nature, and this is something that we've been looking at previously here, is that it actually belongs to the fundamental ground before confusion has taken place. And we're talking about the nature of our consciousness. Now, the thing about what we normally do when we have our ordinary consciousness, we solidify a self and we solidify other, and we operate then within a dualistic framework in which you could say the openness of our reality becomes diminished into a smaller place. And that's where we also begin to see phenomena in terms of this, it becomes solidified, where we begin to think in terms of time. All of a sudden, the experience that we have, the living experience, which is basically just a condition of something that is awake. Once we objectify phenomena and hold them as solid, then we begin to see them operate in relation to ourselves. And that's where we would say something happens that I like, and on the basis of this liking, I attach myself to it, or something happens that I don't like, and then I attach myself to it. We begin to have a dualistic relationship to you could say, the phenomena around us. And this goes further into, you could say, ever deepening narratives that operate within the mind, but where the mind begins to solidify an external reality. So that's where that reality begins to operate with a sense of something happens, and as a result of that, something else happens. And that's where we begin to think in terms of cause and effect. And that's, you could say, our entire experience of the phenomenal world operates with cause and effect. I move my hand because there's not any obstruction, and when I move it from here, it ends up over there. When I plant a seed, something comes out of the ground, and I wave my hand like this, and there's some wind goes that way, And the whole phenomenal world, everything that we essentially navigate in terms of our ordinary phenomenal world, sits on the basis of cause and effect and within a context of time. But if we look, time is again something that is very much relative to where we stand. And time is not a given in and of itself. The basic notion of Buddha nature is very much that the constructs of space and time, they are artificial constructs. They're very much based on our fundamental dualistic appreciation of subject and object. It's not about good or bad. It's not as if we say, oh, something sinful happened, or we were bad, or we were chucked out of paradise, or something's gone wrong, or somebody's blundered, or whatever, But it's more just, this is just how duality plays out. And that's where we then sit with this situation of cause and effect, time and space. And this is, of course, a big topic. But what the Khenpo here is saying, since Buddha nature is without beginning, then we mean this nature is not something that was constructed, you could say 50,000 lifetimes ago or whatever. It's not something that exists in terms of time and space. So, so anyway, since Buddha nature is without beginning, it is present in the base, path, and fruit. Now, when we talk about the path of enlightenment, we talk about the fact that we have this fundamental nature. Let's say that we have essentially we're in good nick, we're healthy, but we've been sleeping with the window open for too long or whatever, and all of a sudden we have a cold, and we go and see the doctor, and he says, well, just try not to sleep with the window open. So that's where we could say we're basically healthy, but there's a moment where we need to treat ourselves. And as a result, we come back to our original condition. And that's essentially what the Buddhist path is teaching, really, that there's a fundamental clarity. It's temporarily obscured. And on the basis of the path, then, we come back to this original condition of non-confusion. So we would say this Buddha nature, which is without beginning, it is present in the base, path, and fruit. The only difference between the three stages is that the base is the time when the Buddha nature is completely obscured by stains. The path is when it is partially purified, and the fruit is when it is completely purified. So we would say all sentient beings, they possess a fundamental purity, but it is temporarily obscured. For the duration of the path, we would say it's partially purified. We would say purity and impurity is mixed. We're not, purity doesn't mean good or bad, but it means just like you could say the window has something that's obscuring it. We would just say there's something that's, you could say some dirt is obscuring it, but it doesn't mean that it's sort of like pure in the sense of being sort of a nice Sunday school boy or girl or whatever, but it just means that there is this element of confusion. So when we engage in the path, then it is a mix where we're sort of, on one hand, we're operating with the vision of purity, but on the other hand, we're also operating with the fact, the humble recognition that there's still a fair bit of neurotic habits that are there. We, on the path, we become, especially as a practitioner of meditation, you become very aware of your own neurosis, and you become humbly aware of it. You become very careful with your own neurosis, because you're aware how it's very, very easily we sort of lose sight of our, you could say, sanity, and we flip into insanity, or you could say just habitual patterns of neurosis. It doesn't look like anybody here is profoundly neurotic, or you could say dangerous, but it's not so much that. It's more just that the habitual pattern is very much that we operate from this insecure place of self. And that's where on the path, we actually get over ourselves to a large extent, and yet we fall back into it. So that's where there's continually sort of an awareness of where we have a potential and also where we have some, you could say, abiding limitations that gradually are wearing out. So so here it goes into some details around some particular aspects, which we might just skip. Actually, I think I'll just leave it at this today, and just feel free to come with any kind of questions. Okay. See if there's any questions from the online gang. So may we say that instead of seeking to relate to our true nature, which solidifies it, rather we may keep focused on transforming bad habits, i.e. to reveal our true. May we say that instead of seeking to relate to our true nature, well, you can say essentially the path is about relating to our true nature. That's where we continually come back to, and that's where you could say the entire theory of Buddhism is really to identify where it is we actually fail to see properly. For example, the moment that we are fixating on a self, that's where we very often would say, well, try and analyze if there really is a self. Try and see if you can find a self. And that's where we've looked at from various angles, you know, what we, for example, refer to as the transitory collection and so forth, where actually we can see that it's not as if we, what we call I, it's necessarily the body or all aspects of the mind. Since that is so many different things, and we actually think of me, we think of something singular and solid and sort of unconditionally there. But if we think of it in terms of what we call the skandhas, the aggregations of our body and our mind, we can actually see, hey, that's not it. So we can say it's not the same. It's also not other. It's not as if there's a self that's completely in control of these aspects of who we are. And you can say our body sort of falls apart as it's doing. The mind is always changing. Again, so there, to actually, if we analyze, we can see the whole idea of self is actually what we call an imputation. It's a delusional condition that's taking place within consciousness, but it actually has no reality. But that theoretical understanding is all very good, and it's essential really to know what we're doing. But more than anything, there's a necessary to have the component of then meditation in which actually the ordinary stress and the ordinary speed and the ordinary discomfort, the ordinary grasping and wanting and all of that, it actually is given a place where it can just calm down. And so that's where there's an experiential component. Otherwise, we'd just be stuck with theory. So again, that's where the path is very much about relating to our true nature. Yeah. But at the same time, also, you say here, rather we may keep focusing on transforming bad habits. Well, that's, you could say, there's two aspects to the path. Again, there is the sort of the aspect of beginning to see reality, but there's also the skillful means, upaya, which works with who we are. And that's where we're all very different. And so for some, you could say for some persons, then it's very helpful to be really attentive to cultivating, you could say, patience. If we, for example, have a lot of anger, then some people, they don't have so much anger. They might be sort of driven by a lot of insecurity and ambition. Then they might need to sort of reflect on that. So there's various ways in which we relate to our bad habits, but that's on the level then of upaya, skillful means. Isn't the act of relating an act of solidifying the object, i.e. subject and object, i.e. subject and object then is forming, isn't the act of relating an act of solidifying the object? Isn't the act of relating an act of solidifying the object? Yes. So that's why we talk about this. We also talked about earlier, what we call relative truth, is that within our experience, we do operate with the notion of duality. We can analyze and see, in fact, this duality is an artificial construct, but at the same time, for the time being, we're very stuck in a relative truth. We're very much stuck within the experience of a subject and an object. Is this making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Any questions?
I always heard this word suchness. It sort of seems to. Could you clarify that?
Sure, the word suchness. Yeah, sure. Essentially, the difference between Buddhas and sentient beings is that we're not really relating to things as they are. We're relating to our projections about things. So, for example, the way that we see this room, each and every one of us, we see it in a particular way. When we have wisdom, we know that we're all seeing it differently. So that's where there's an element of suchness that plays in. For example, let's say that we're listening to the same piece of music, right? And someone will say, "Ah, that's really a beautiful piece of music." And someone will say, "I hate this piece of music." And you know that your personal experience is not really how the music is. You just know it's your personal reaction to the music. And when someone else is saying, you know, something else, we know that it's actually just their particular reality, right? And that's where we know there's a difference between the way that we're perceiving it and the way how things actually are. So suchness is when we acknowledge that things are actually not the way that we think of it. So when I hear a piece of music, I think it's so beautiful, and somebody else says that's dreadful. I know that what I'm hearing is not how that's my particular private experience, and what they're hearing is their particular private experience. Now, if I know that this is just my personal thing, and somebody says it's awful, I'll just say, yeah, well, you know, that's how you hear it. But if I don't, then I might say, hey, that's a beautiful piece of music. Are you crazy? You know? And the other person says, it's terrible. Are you crazy? This is how conflicts begin, right? And it's both because we're missing suchness. We don't realize that it's just our particular projection. Yeah.
So suchness is before the opinion about the music.
It's just the music in and of itself, you know? Yeah. It's just wafting through the air innocently and being picked up by different recipients, right?
If we're looking at it,
yeah,
then everyone's going to have a different version of suchness.
Well, that's the thing. The thing is, the individual perception is not suchness.
Right.
That's why it's important to know suchness to get along, actually. And we kind of do it, but there's also a lot of places where we're very much stuck in our likes and dislikes, you know? So we react, and that's on the basis of failing to see suchness. Then we get angry, or we want something very badly, or whatever. That's what's so nice about, you could say, when we come across persons that have just a little more suchness than we might have. Then we sort of go, oh, this is a very easygoing person, you know. And that's also why we're attracted to the sage or the Dalai Lama or a wise person, because they're actually having a much nicer time. They're getting along with reality. When we fail to see suchness, we're fixated on just things that we want. So we're seeing a very small fraction of reality, because we're sort of like, just this is what I like, this is what I don't like, all the rest, you know, that's happening to me. So that's where The sage is actually somebody who's, we would say, is free, liberated, and due to suchness, realizing suchness. Yes.
So when we come to this notion of the Vipassana insight-wide perspective, it starts to manifest spontaneously when we're settled, and just to come through. It's sort of kind of hidden, you know, you sort of hope for, but it's a bit of grace that sort of starts to manifest. It's sort of, it's nothing you can bring back. You basically let yourself be receptive, and then it starts to arrive. That more or less the way you don't really play a doing role in that process.
That's right. So I better, else I'm going to get in trouble here to the online audience. So there's a proposition that when Vipassana is where we begin to interfere less with our perceptions. Is that
Well,
it?
in other words, when we start to, the mud settles and the glass water becomes clear, there is actually a context for the insight possible to start in that space.
Yes.
Okay.
So the question is when.
Well, no, the question hasn't happened.
Okay.
So the question is that sort of wisdom manifesting like Parita quality, like the wisdom of Manjushri, starting to manifest itself through the individual settling themselves enough that it starts to then penetrate into the
Spontaneously.
Yeah. In other words, is that a chance for the Parita to emerge into in the realm of the dualistic and start to gradually wake up the individual who's attempting to settle into a more complete informed space.
I think you've answered it.
Well, I'm just, is that the Buddhist perspective?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the question is the Buddhist perspective that when the mind settles, then the Vipassana will arise organically, spontaneously?
As a process of illumination, as a process of gradually building wisdom.
Yeah.
Become receptive to being informed by that.
Well, in principle, yes. But I would say, okay, so we could in principle say that Vipassana organically grows out of shamatha, calm abiding, right? But it's helped by the thinking mind that rationally asserts the lack of inherent existence in phenomena. That's where the analytical, you could say, well, you know, just as the famous example with the rope and the snake, that we might see that this thing that we perceive as a snake is a rope right away. That's what we call the sudden awakening. So we're looking at a snake and we go, oh, we're terrified. And then we look, oh, no, it's just a rope, That might take place. But there might also be a gradual process in which we need to be sort of lured into the analysis because we're seriously delusional. That looks like a snake to me. No, it's a rope. Really? And that's where it's helpful if there is some process of, scrutiny that's encouraged through, you could say, the rational understanding.
But that can just be a process of cultivating like curiosity to know how things are.
Yes, and it is very much curiosity.
So just cultivating like a real hunger to understand how is it like this? Why is it really like this?
Yes.
That way it's becoming sort of cultivating conditions to be inviting that.
Very much. I mean, yes. So the question is, would this be helped by you could say, a curiosity or inquisitiveness, right? And that is, in fact, what the entire theoretical component of analysis is all about. Just like you would do it in science. As a scientist, you would keep analyzing. You kind of onto something. You have a hypothesis, and you keep analyzing, and you say, yes, aha, that sort of thing.
See, that's the core. It's much less about the information you're gathering than it is the desire to know. It's the desire to know that's much more important.
Well, the desire to know will bring about what we call certainty. It will eventually, there will be not so much you will have knowledge, or you could even say data, but it's sort of irrefutable, you could say, in the sense of just being knowledge. So just as when you do see that the snake in fact isn't a snake but a rope, there's a certainty, and that's where you just have to, then you begin to, you could say, familiarize yourself with that. But it's not based on a blind faith. It's based on an initial curiosity, inquisitiveness, that then leads to a rational certainty. And that's where the path begins, because that's where you actually then know what on earth am I doing? You know, when you sit down to meditate.
So organizing your perception around that sort of knowing or desire to know then provides a conduit for certainty to occur. In other words, it has to come through perception. You have to perceive that the snake is not, or the rope is not.
Yes, it has to be, you could say, perceived in the empirical sense of observing and arriving at a conclusion about what your perceptions are. So it's very, in the Buddhist teaching, you have this thing called pramana, or valid cognition, which is very much about, you could say, well, it's epistemology. It's looking into what can I trust in terms of my perceptions.
Yeah. Clarifying perceptions that are reliable, lead you to the conviction that's actually based in a durable or authentic quality of knowing.
Yes.
Versus the delusion of, I think this is the way it's based on.
Yeah, that's right. So that's exactly it. So the question is, you know, to arrive at a place of certainty rather than belief, if I may. And that's a really important point. And that's why I always have sort of like insisting that Buddhism is not religion in the sense that we think of it popularly, but it is right up there with science. And that's where it's not that I'm keen to be, you know, associated with MIT or UTS, but it's more that there has to be an appreciation that what we're doing here is not about blind faith or belief or we'd like to this or that. It's really just about looking at reality and getting at suchness, you know, getting at the suchness.
It shows this image and it shows a black and white blotch on the page.
Yeah.
It says, try to figure out what this is. And eventually you realize it's a profile of a cow looking in a pasture. And once you see it, you know this is absolutely what it is. So there is a point where I think it gives the example when you can recognize your perception and conviction that this is true.
I guess so. I guess, yeah. Yeah. I mean, basically, the way that we arrive at this is through, you could say, investigation. Yeah. And not through wishful thinking. That's the point. Yeah. Okay. There's a how does one actually relate to suchness when our experience is such a projection? Well, the first thing is to realize that it is projection. And the less we are entangled, the less we humbly recognize that our projections are projections, the more that we know that, the more we're able to actually, you could say, not get entangled in our particular private version of things, but actually begin to have then an aerial perspective. And that is what's implicit in Vipassana, that we're not wrapped up in our personal version of things, but rather there's an openness with regards to phenomena. And that's where we actually discontinue the ordinary practice of conceptualizing things solidly in one way or another. That's essentially what meditation does. Meditation is about weaning us off the sort of the habit of pigeonholing and solidifying things, both in terms of ourselves and also in terms of our perceptions. Okay. All right. So, yeah. Just a little light discussion around about the nature of reality. Okay, well, enough said. And this is like the first period here. This is more just a little bit of theory. There was a text here that I'm going through, but this is, I would say, it's good to every once in a while to sort of stop up and just, you could say, get back to basics a bit. Okay. So I'm just gonna, so this is the end of the part one. And then the next part is then meditation. So I'll just conclude this session. So usually when we do any kind of study and practice, there's usually there's a very beautiful thing that my teachers would always emphasize. And they refer to this as the three excellences. And that is, whenever we do something, to look at why we're doing it. Because we sometimes just sort of, we might think, oh, wonder what I should do. And sometimes we want to do the right thing, but we don't quite know whether we are doing the right thing, yeah? And that's why we have to realize that the actions that we do, they're not really in and of themselves, good or bad. It's the intentions behind. So, for example, we might do something really good, but if the intention is really just that other people will think we're really good, then it's really just solidifying our self-centering and so forth. Whereas we might sometimes be, you could say, doing something that looks to other people as being, unkind. For example, we might say to somebody, "Don't do this," and they won't like us because we said to them, "Don't do that." But we know it's going to be, destructive for them. So that's where that might look as if it's unkind, but if it's coming from a place of really caring, then it's actually a really good thing. So it's about not so much about what we do, but what's behind it. So whenever, for example, we do meditation or study like we're doing here, my teachers would always emphasize, before you do this, think that it's something that you're doing because you'd like to get to the bottom of what drives suffering. Not just for yourself, but for everybody. Doing something profoundly, you could say, useful. And when there's that sort of attitude to begin with, then the undertaking itself takes on a whole different value. It's not just sort of a random thing I ended up doing. And then also when one has done something really good, let's say that we actually did something with a really good intention, then if at the end we sort of go, oh, well, I'm a pretty cool cat, I've just been doing something really great. And particularly like we were talking about before, sort of spiritual arrogance can really easily take place. And that's where there's a very beautiful practice in Mahayana Buddhism, which is always what we call dedication. So when we conclude a particular practice or study or whatever, then we dedicate the merit. We essentially say, whatever there was good in this, I give it away. So that's actually, we can travel much lighter. Otherwise, if we walk out of, a session of meditation or something or other, and either we feel incredibly holy, or else we think, my God, I have to hold on to, whatever, then it makes it a little bit clunky. And that's why it's so much easier if we just think, whatever there's good in this, I just give it away, may it benefit others. So these sort of, I'm just going to do a little chant here that essentially reflects that kind of dedication. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. So thank you very much. We'll just take a 2-minute break just to stretch our legs and so on. And then I'll say a little bit about the practice of meditation, and then we'll do some meditation practice. So the next part here in our program is, I'll just say a little bit about meditation. And of course, I was in fact saying a lot about meditation just before, to some extent. But I'd like to do this from the purely practical application of meditation, which I think everybody gets the point that if we provide a structure for calm, then we're doing ourselves a favor. So meditation is never a question of sort of either running away from the world or sort of putting a straitjacket around ourselves and limiting ourselves. Is rather just like the example with the glass of water. It's providing the conditions for us to just essentially flourish as persons. So it's just like eating good food. And that's where sometimes you could say, from the point of view of the busy mind that very easily is caught up and agitated, from the point of view of the hey guys, we're just starting. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, we'll probably finish, let's see here, 35, 10 past 7 or something like that. We'll finish around 10 past 7. Yeah, 10 past, 10:15, so sort of something like that. Thanks. So there's nothing really that difficult about meditation as such, in the sense of understanding the logic of it. But it's very often because we in the modern world, we're so habituated to always be onto something. There's always something going on. And so we feel very uncomfortable to sit and do nothing. And we're very often we feel fidgety and uncomfortable. To sit down and do nothing is actually not easy. Yeah, I see this very often even with hardened practitioners. If there's talk about meditation, then it's like, I think I need to go and do something else, or I should be doing this, or I should do that. And so there's very often sort of a little bit of an obstacle to get to the actual sitting down. And that's where, in a way, when we practice meditation, it's almost like we should expect a resistance to be the first part. I'm saying this right away because that's definitely something that's you could say very often, maybe with if meditation is new to us, it's like, wow, I'm going to meditate. This is really interesting. And so we sit down, and actually there might actually, because we're doing something we haven't done before, then sort of all of a sudden unusual things happen. It's like, wow, this is really far out. And to some extent, there is something fantastic about doing something that we've never done before. And it's not, it's normal. You could say our energies and just our mind and everything actually begins to really be in a place that's really comfortable. But there's also a point where this becomes normal. And that's where we could say the novelty wears off. And that's where, you could say meditation as something that's exciting and far out doesn't really last that long. There's a sort of the idea of, oh, it's full moon and I'm going to meditate and I'm going to have a special experience. And that's where, in fact, what we're doing with meditation is actually opening our mind. And that's where the practice of opening our mind is where we begin to be much more accepting with whatever is actually happening. But if meditation is something where we go in and think, oh, there's something far out happening here, then first of all, even if it does last for some time, that something special is happening, we're just developing a new addiction. Because if something far out happens every time we sit down and meditate, it's just going to become a new addiction where we are sort of resentful when we're not meditating. Like, I want to go back to meditating. And then we could end up sort of just living out in the countryside and just going increasingly weird, just wanting only to meditate and do nothing else. And we just kind of resent when we have to relate with the world. And that's not particularly helpful. So that's where meditation from that point of view, even if it were that we would always go into a special zone, it wouldn't be helpful at all. It would just increase our self-centering. It would increase our alienation to the world. And it would definitely not be something that would take us, you could say, into a greater place. It would basically take us into a very small place. And you sometimes have that. You know, just the other day I was talking to somebody who was reading some particular Buddhist text and getting it completely wrong and basically just sort of retreating into themselves and just wanting to be away from the world. And that's not really what the Buddha was about. The Buddha was about awakening, not about going into a small place. So that's where meditation, we really mustn't approach it as something of going into a particular zone. The other thing also, the problem with if meditation is something that's really far out and special, is that then also, if we sit down and meditate, we're essentially waiting for something to happen. And that's where I'm sitting down and meditating. And last Tuesday, I had a fantastic meditation, and I want to get back to that place. And that happens, of course. This is only normal. But unfortunately, that's again not really what we want to do when we're meditating, because then again, we're just sitting there waiting for something. And again, it's just essentially based on, you could say, the self-centered project of me. What we would, however, want is, and that's where there's something really beautiful about meditation, is actually if we could arrive at a place where we begin to become much more open and accepting about the world as it is, rather than how we think it should be. People should behave in a particular way. I want this to happen. I want this, I want that. And that's where we struggle, because the whole world doesn't revolve around us. Things that we don't like happen. People do things that we don't like. And the more that we get, you could say, caught up in the drama around me, the more we have a difficult time relating to the world, the more we could actually let go of this mind that all the time refers back to me, the more we could actually be comfortable with the world as it is. And that's where we're beginning to touch on suchness. That's where we're beginning to actually become free from the normal, you could say, expectations about how things should be. And the number one, you say, culprit in this are the thoughts that we ordinarily generate, the narratives. This has happened to me. This is what I want. These, you know, what happened in the past, yeah, it happened, but it's only as real as we keep regurgitating these memories. And the sort of the ideas, I want this to happen. Well, as we know, we don't know how things are going to work out. But if we sit and sort of, we think about the past, if we think about the future, we're very poorly equipped to relate to the reality, which is right here. And so we're never really relating to the world. We're stuck in our heads. The curious thing about meditation is that it's actually getting out of our heads. It's actually beginning to be here. Our minds are always seduced by our thoughts. And that's where the radical thing about meditation, and even nowadays when it's appropriated in psychology, is that it actually takes us out of our heads. It takes us out of the thoughts. So that's where the practice of meditation is very much coming back to a very fresh place of just being fully present. And that's also, if you look at someone who meditates, if you look at great meditators, what they you could say give out is a freshness, is a kindness, an openness, an acceptance. When I came across Buddhism when I was young, it was sort of presented to me by, you know, some very nice people who had been to Nepal and India, and they had, you know, smoked a fair bit of charas and dropped a fair bit of acid, but also sort of come across the Tibetans. And they sort of, oh, wow, man, the Tibetans. And they managed to actually invite Tibetans to come to Denmark. And there were some very great teachers that came. And at that time, for me, very difficult to understand all this stuff about Buddhism, because, you know, it was sort of being transmitted by some fairly confused persons. But what really drew me to Buddhism was actually the quality of these people, the quality of their, you could say, freshness, their niceness, their just openness, kindness, you know, intelligence. There was all these things that I actually, as a person, and have recognized in my life are actually really great things in people. And I recognized this was taking place in these people too. I was like, yes, okay, I don't know exactly what's going on here. There's a lot of strange things that I'm not really understanding, but I like these people and I trust them implicitly. And that's sort of basically what made me stick around and sort of go into the you know, into the deeper understanding of Buddhism and sort of clarify my own confusion. But the quality of meditation is the opposite of going in. It's actually more sort of letting go and being fully present. So that's where the beauty of the nature of meditation is this openness that is the you could say the objective of that. And also with that openness, there's a very important quality that comes with it, which is kindness, caring for others. Because when we retreat into what I want, what I don't like, then it's very solid, this sense of me. And this has very little to do with what's happening out there. And we very often are sort of caught up in you could say, a barrier between self and other. And what we're actually doing when we allow for this openness to take place, we begin to actually be more participating and sensitive to the needs of others and more accommodating and essentially accepting about the world around us. And that's where you could say the spontaneous quality of vipassana, of suchness, and so on, the sort of the character of that is very much what we call compassion. And that's also where, even though we might not be practicing meditation, to be compassionate actually takes us into that place as well. So we can kind of go at it from two angles. And there was a little bit of question earlier that was, I think, touching on that, which was, you know, we can on one hand, you could say, connect with reality, and you could say drop our normal fixation on self. But we can also be proactive in terms of cultivating kindness and compassion, and that also implicitly brings about that, you could say, openness. So there's two ways we can come at it, which we sometimes refer to as wisdom and skillful means. One is through, you could say, the practice of meditation, and one is through cultivating a mindset that is essentially kind and compassionate. So either way, you could say the whole nature of what we're dealing with in terms of meditation is very much this quality of being present and open. But the reason why, since the time of the Buddha, that people have actually sat down, because we could say, well, I'm going to be open and kind in my life. But the thing is, a lot of this, like I started off saying, so much of who we are and the way we interact with the world is held by thoughts that are happening all the time, even though we don't notice them. They're kind of like an undertow. They're always happening unnoticed. And that's where when we're busy, we actually we're not really aware of what's going on within ourselves. Whereas if we provide a framework where we actually are aware of what's happening, then we might not be seduced by and carried away by these sort of attitudes and this undertow of thinking the way it ordinarily happens when we basically are unaware. So you could say the format or the structure of meditation is very much to facilitate awareness. And it has to come from a humble place where we realize how unaware we are. If we think, well, I'm aware, then of course, then it's, okay, what can you do? But if there's an awareness that I am very unaware, then we can see the value of actually sitting and coming back to being present within a context of sitting on our cushion and not doing anything. And like I was saying earlier, sitting and doing nothing is not easy. So that's where providing the framework, as we do in meditation, is very helpful from that point of view. Now, purely in terms of the technique. Okay, here what I do is what we do in Buddhist traditions overall is usually before we do any meditation, we do some chanting. In this case, it's a short liturgy, which essentially is about thinking of the Buddha, just visualizing the Buddha present. Now, what's difficult for many persons in the modern world is it's very, what the Indians call bhakti. There's a lot of devotion in it. So there's a lot of like, chanting to the Buddha as someone who you could say has seen truth and who possesses a lot of great qualities. So that's where you could say the traditional liturgy sometimes is a little bit sort of sugar-coated for the modern person. We're modern, skeptical, hard, intelligently people, and so on. But at the same time, I would really be selling you, I would really not be honest if I didn't say this is a big part of the living Buddhist culture. That there's an incredible, like I have a guru, I have a teacher, and I respect my teacher deeply. And there's a culture in the Buddhist teaching of actually learning, and particularly in the learning process, a lot of humility and a lot of respect. And I think those of you who are familiar with Indian culture, there's a lot of sort of culture around, we have respect around teachers and so on, which of course we don't have in the modern culture, So that's where the practice that we do to begin with, I hope you're, you could say, open-minded enough to be okay with it. But anyway, the first part of it is this chant. And then at one point, then there's a chant in the visualization. We say we visualize the Buddha outside, and identify the Buddha as having all these qualities. And then we dissolve the reference point as Buddha as external. And that's because, of course, the Buddha is really just there as a reflection of the qualities that we naturally possess. So ultimately then, the Buddha as the teacher is dissolved as an external reference point, and then we settle into meditation. And the basics of the meditation that I present here, just very briefly, because this is just sort of a brief presentation, but it consists of 3 points. One is to sit, and to sit with the back straight. And if you can sit on a floor, great. If you need to sit on a chair, it's fine. Grab a chair. I don't want anybody tortured here or breaking their legs or anything. But the most important point really is that the body is straight, and also taking the shoulders a little bit back, taking the chin a bit in, hands on the knees or in the lap, and relaxing the jaw, breathing through the nose if we need, but also if the nose is blocked, then breathing through the mouth, leaving a little bit of an opening in the mouth. And then essentially sitting without moving for a while. And what we do then is we sit here for 15 minutes, and then we do 5 minutes of walking meditation, then again we sit for 15 minutes. So that's the sort of the nature of the meditation session. We'll have a break before we begin, so you can stretch your legs and all of that, or grab a chair, however. But that's the physical aspect, and that, you could say, that exercise of just sitting calmly is very helpful in terms of just essentially us beginning to relate to grounding ourselves in our physical body, being properly present in our physical body. The second aspect is then something that brings about this quality of mindfulness, and that is where we come back to the focus on the breath. And in the practice of focusing on the breath, we particularly focus on the out-breath. The reason being that sort of connects us and takes us a little bit out of ourselves. Of course, in some meditation traditions, they don't emphasize that. But in my tradition, then we always say there's a trick when it comes to focusing on the breath. If you actually focus on the out-breath, there's a sense of actually, you could say, diminishing the barrier between self and other. There's a greater openness in the space that we're sitting in. So that's where the tradition that I follow, then we emphasize focusing on the out-breath. And it essentially is, as we're sitting, we just are aware that the breath exits from the nostrils and just it dissolves into space. And then just relaxing and letting the in-breath happening without any particular thought, just actually just allowing a gap. And then again, being quite attentive, proactively attentive to the out-breath. The traditional image is just like when we're threading a needle, it takes a little bit of focus. So there's a sort of focus as the out-breath goes out, and then relaxing as the breath dissolves into space, in-breath happening naturally. So that's the second point. First point, the body. Second point, the focus of the mind. And that's actually what we're doing when we're meditating. We're just focusing on that. But the normal thoughts will happen. So we're going to be wondering, you know, what's happening tomorrow? What happened today? All the usual thoughts are going to happen. Memories of the past, thoughts about the future. I have to do this. I have to think of that. All of that happens. All of these thoughts will inevitably happen. But that's where, while they're happening, we just come back to the reference point of being present. They're happening here. The thoughts are not happening. We're not in the past. We're not in the future. We're actually sitting here. And the coming back to the breath is actually what anchors us in being fully present. So the thoughts, they happen, but they're happening right now. So that's where we're aware of the thoughts. They take place. No stopping thoughts. They're going to be there. But at the same time, it's taking place right now. And that's where just having the reference point of the breath, coming back to the awareness of the breath, it prevents us from being absorbed in the thoughts. Now, inevitably, it happens when we're meditating that we will be absorbed in thoughts. And that's where, oh, I'm supposed to be meditating, back to the breath. And that's where it's important to not say, oh, I shouldn't be distracted or whatever, but to just come back to the breath. And actually, in that moment of just coming back, that's good. What actually happens sometimes when we're like focused on the breath and we're thinking, oh, I'm really focused on the breath, I'm really not distracted. And in fact, these are just more thoughts actually. So that's just another. So actually, the most beautiful moment is actually when we break away from thinking and just we're here. There's a moment where actually there's no contamination taking place. Then, you know, even though we do have some sustaining of, you could say, mindfulness, it's very important to just let that be very light and not get overly excited, you know. Of course, you know, it does happen. But anyway, the basics of what happens when we are sitting and whatever happens with the mind is really just to come back to the breath and be aware that any thoughts that are happening, they're happening right now, right here, and they're very welcome, but they have no more reality than, you could say, the clouds in space. They're here, but we just come back to the breath. We are under no obligation to sort of say, yes, sir, and kowtow and, you know, take them, you know, have them control us. They're just thoughts. So they're there, but we choose to bring our focus back to the breath. We're not trying to suppress them. We're not trying to kick the thoughts out. We're not trying to manipulate the thoughts in any way. We just know there's thoughts happening. Come back to the breath. And that's where the thoughts, they begin to have less and less grip on us. That's where we begin to actually discover something that we hadn't discovered before. That's where there begins to have a little bit of an aerial perspective that we then call vipassana. So the component of us remaining focused we call shamatha, and the degree to which we then begin to be less, you could say, submissive to our thinking, this is then where we begin to approach what we call vipassana. So we'll take a 2-minute break, and I'll distribute. Actually, I'm going to ask James if you can just distribute the texts, and then we'll do this brief chanting practice, and then we'll do some meditation, and then that's it. Thank you. So meditation again, we'll sit 15 minutes, do 5 minutes of walking. We can walk around here, and then 15 minutes of sitting again. All right. I'll just read the very opening, in the italics on page 3, I think it is. In the Samadhi Raj Sutra, it is said, those who while walking, sitting, standing, or sleeping recollect the moonlight Buddha will always be in the Buddha's presence and will attain the vast nirvana. And his pure body is the color of gold, beautiful is the protector of the world. Whoever visualizes him like this practices the meditation of the Bodhisattvas. In keeping with this, we should practice remembering our incomparable teacher, the Lord of Sages, in the following way. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. Ah, is the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence. Magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jeweled lion throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture. His right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders, and the like. A vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the imperfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teaching, ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. To all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the 3 jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yata muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 Om 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 muni muni mahamunaya soha. Muni muni mahamunaya. Om muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 Om mani muni mahamunaya soha. From the Buddha's body, there emanates a great radiance of multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. So we'll just go to the pretty much the last page where it says concluding aspiration prayers. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun, may the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers, we pray for their precious lives to be long, we pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagat dukkani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagat dukkani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagat dukkani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagat dukkani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you very much.